Good morning and welcome to the CBI at 10. I'm a stock record here, I'm sorry. Every week it feels you wake up and there is just a volume of news to try and interpret and if you like, plan for. Emergence from December the 2nd and the return to tiering, Christmas into the new year, vaccines, max testing. Oh, we've got a comprehensive spending review this week. And did we mention Brexit? This is just a small array of things that are on the minds of most people in business this morning. And like all of our CBI at 10 calls, the real benefit of this is to try to hear what the CBI is gathering from its contacts inside number 10, number 11, Bays, the bank, etc. And I'm going to come to Josh Hardy, the Deputy Director General of the CBI, to help us with that. But we're also really fortunate that Rachel Kent, who's a partner at Hogan Lovells, and that Chris Hurld, who's the head of regions at KPMG, is with us this morning. So thank you both for joining us. If I might just do a quick trip around the bay with Josh first, just to get a sense of where we are before we dive into Brexit. And for everyone on the call, as ever, the thing that's really most valuable about this is to hear from you. So please do put in questions or observations. If you want to put them in furiously and anonymously, do that too, and we'll make sure we weave them into this discussion. But Josh, before we get to Brexit, shall we just start with what we're expecting on COVID restrictions and the next steps?
Yeah, so thanks, James, and Rachel and Chris, thanks so much for coming on. I think it's going to be so useful to hear your expertise. But you're right, it's another week, and it's another potentially extraordinary week. And you could have picked any one of these weeks and said they were sort of era defining, and I think that's true again. What are we expecting to hear? So firstly, on COVID, I think probably three sets of announcements over the week, starting this afternoon at 3:30 with the Prime Minister, where we're expecting the focus to be on rules. So how, as we come out of lockdown next week, how are the rules going to be adapted and changed? So that will, of course, be around the tiering system. Expect some tweaks there, particularly to tiers 2 and 3. We're expecting relaxation around curfew, for example. So last orders at 10, but closure at 11, which for many pubs and restaurants will be very, very welcome, but of course is still a curfew overall for many parts of the economy. The rolling out of mass testing and sort of testing super centres provides some opportunity to be a bit more flexible around areas like quarantine and self-isolation, where more regular testing may enable those timeframes to be reduced. So critical for those people in work that have to self-isolate. But a lot of that detail, I think, if we're honest, is still being worked out, because it's that interface between simplicity and real detail driven by scientific evidence. So expect a fair bit on that today. We've been very clear at the CBI. We came out very strongly last week that the reason it needs to happen now is so that businesses can prepare. We saw in Wales 5 days notice made a massive difference to the way in which business could build their resilience and get ready. So we'll welcome as much detail as possible. But of course, the rules are only one part of it. Tomorrow, we expect to hear a little bit more about this Christmas debate. Everybody wants to have a Merry Christmas, to be able to see those family and friends that we haven't been able to see for so long. But that party mustn't leave too much of an economic hangover in January. So how do you balance that flexibility, a few households being able to come together over those critical days without driving essentially another lockdown in January? So expect a bit more around that tomorrow. And then later in the week, Thursday most likely, probably the most contentious bit of all. And that is which regions in which tiers. And we've seen before the debate and the division that can cause. We know that debate and division in itself actually damages compliance. So we hope that that's done with a spirit of consultation with those regional leaders. And of course, we're also seeing continued fragmentation across the UK. So you've got Wales coming out of their circuit breaker, their fire breaker. You've got Scotland going in 11 council areas. You've got, if we're honest, Northern Ireland sort of moving betwixt and between. So the more that we can do to bring those together, the better, because it does feel right now with good news coming out around vaccines. We had Oxford this morning, 70 to 90% efficacy. We've had Pfizer and BioNTech. We've had the brilliantly Dolly Parton funded Moderna vaccine. All of that is positive, but we've got this big chunk of time between the end of lockdown and the beginning of the rollout of vaccine where the priority has to be to keep things as stable as possible.
Josh, can I just ask you about that? Because I wonder whether it's clearer than we think, that gap that you mentioned, in that, you know, the Chancellor's come out and extended furlough in principle through till March. Should we understand that the next phase, the tiering phase, probably runs for that period, the end of March towards Easter? Is that what businesses should be planning for?
In an ideal world, yes, because if you know what the tiering is and you can understand if infection rates ebb and flow, it won't be a static thing, regions might move between tiers, but at least you know that structure. At least right. You know the rules, at least you know you can see the direction of travel and you know what support you're going to get. So if we can maintain that consistency between now and the spring, that will be a huge help. But if infection rates spike, can you guarantee there won't be a second national lockdown? You absolutely can't. And that's why that Christmas period is so critical, because that's probably the single biggest thing that will affect whether we stay in tiers or whether we have to adapt it. But compliance generally is vital, which is the regional dimension.
Sorry for interrupting. And are you weighing in at the CBI on the Christmas debate, or are you essentially, or is it really cooked and you're waiting to hear this week?
We've been having good behind-the-scenes conversations and being very, very clear. I mean, it's absolutely that dilemma. It's where behavioural economics meets financial economics. Right. How do you if you don't relax things at Christmas, there is a real fear that people just ignore the rules. And if people start ignoring the rules, how do you get them back? So you've got to loosen a bit. You've got to give people a good time. You can't be the Grinch, but at the same time, you don't want to do it in such a way that you have that, you know, last week we had all those stories about 1 day relaxation is 5 days lockdown in January.
Yes.
5 days relaxation is basically January gone. That doesn't make economic sense. So how do you find that balance? So that's what we get behind the scenes conversations. We'll see where we end up tomorrow, and then we'll see, if I'm honest, how we respond to that.
Right. Okay. I'm aware that we've got this massive subject of Brexit, but I just want to also just touch on the comprehensive spending review. So the Chancellor sort of gave a flavour, but not much detail. Where do you think this is headed?
Well, I think the first thing to remember is because of COVID, this is only a 1 year spending review. But it is vital because so many firms want to be able to lift their heads up and think about the future. We're having that conversation with many businesses right now, and the spending review will give us indications. We've of course heard, and probably the key narrative will be actually around public sector pay and the pay freeze there. That will dominate. But underneath that, we're actually expecting quite a lot of positive stuff for firms. So we put our submission in a few weeks ago. Some of the key things in there, we are hearing positive noises about it. So building on the 10-point net zero plan that the Prime Minister launched last week, expect more there. Importantly, a national infrastructure bank. So, you know, the Prime Minister's commitment to build. We've heard from a lot of businesses, we like the commitment, show us the money. You know, actually, let's get moving on this. Do expect more on that. Critically as well, the Shared Prosperity Fund, the replacement for so much of that regional EU funding, which was announced some time ago, but the detail has been, well, few and far between. We're expecting more detail there, which will be really valuable, particularly for those regions where that funding needs replacing urgently. More on infrastructure. So reform of the Green Book, a long-term CBI bugbear. We hope investment for local projects such as roads, but also more on skills, individual learning accounts, funding for the implementation of trade deals. Brilliant that we got Canada over the line at the end of last week. We've got Japan as well. We hope for Turkey soon with a deal in place. So again, we'll see the detail, but the conversations we're having suggest there will be a number of things that are valuable for business. And of course, we've also had that conversation about tax that coming through. We don't expect any significant movement around that in the short term, and we believe that's critical because the most important thing is to get our economy growing again.
Yeah, okay. We could have such a have a massive debate about all of those things. So, but we're gonna hold off. Perhaps we'll do that, Josh, if we can, after the CSR, after the comprehensive spending.
Absolutely.
But can the one other thing that was clear from Rishi Sunak's interview over the weekend was optimism you felt in Downing Street that some deal was coming. Is that what you're hearing, Josh?
I think there is a degree of optimism. I mean, plenty of slip between cup and lip.
Yeah.
But as things stand, I think it does feel like things are moving in the right direction. We've heard the first signs of actually a narrowing of the gap on those long-standing issues: fish, level playing field, governance. But clearly, some way to go. So those negotiations continue. Meanwhile, business desperately hoping for good news, but preparing for the worst. We've had a series, two actually. I think two makes a series. We'll have had three this week. That definitely makes a series. Very good task force preparation roundtables with Michael Gove. It's something we asked for from the Prime Minister a few weeks ago. They were set up quickly. Last week we did advanced manufacturing. No, the week before. Last week we did agri. And those are businesses, about 25 of us, looking the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster in the eye and saying, this is what businesses are actually experiencing on the ground. This is what they can prepare for. This is what they can't prepare for. This is how the insight the government is giving is helping or not helping. They've been very good. They've been very honest, very frank, and very straight. And I think the key point we're making through all of that is, yes, get the information in the best possible place, of course. But for so many businesses, actually, there are too many unanswered questions. And those won't be answered until you get a deal. So get that deal, get it quickly, because then you'll get that next wave of preparation and be ready for that to give the support that is needed. And I won't go into detail of the areas because we have Rachel and Chris who are the real experts. But for so many of our services members, it's about that mutual recognition. Is that going to be country by country? How do we find out? How do we identify what the rules are and how we adapt? It's about travel and mobility. Again, can we get a sort of fly-in, fly-out deal across the EU? Or in the case of no deal, are we really going to have to do that state by state? Presence abroad, opening offices, what are the rules around directors, around staff? And critically, that data adequacy deal, not part of the FTA, but a real keenness once the deal is agreed to move on to that within days. But all of that shows just how fundamental the stability a deal will bring, even if it doesn't have masses for services in it in its own right.
And Josh, sorry, you said the third session with Michael Gove, what's it on? Do you know what this week's one is on?
Just being agreed now, but I expect it to have more of a services flavour.
Okay, fine, all right. Just because I imagine there are people on the call who may think, "Oh, I'd like to participate or feed into that." As ever, do raise any thoughts like that to us, and we'll weave them in. Rachel, can I come to you? I suppose you've been sort of perfectly teed up there. Can we start? Rachel, what I was hoping to do was to hear a little from you on financial services and a bit more from Chris more broadly on professional services and what happens next. Can you just give us a bit of context? What's your sense of how many financial services firms are prepared as things stand for the end of the year and for Brexit? How many of them are ready for the changes in passporting, etc.?
Oh, I guess that's quite an easy one because that tends to go with size. So clearly the larger firms have decided to set up a subsidiary. They knew about the requirement in advance because regulators have been asking them for progress reports for the last 2 years, and they are, if they haven't finally finished transferring, they certainly are very well advanced in that transfer. So I wouldn't have said there are any issues there. But it's interesting that there are then a number of smaller clients, some of whom were also very aware of the issue and who took the decision very early on not to set up a subsidiary because, I mean, this sort of market access issue is a bit like you don't know how much you love something till you lose it. And passporting simply is an extremely efficient business model that has facilitated cross-border business for smaller firms that might otherwise not have been possible from a financial perspective. So lots of more medium-sized firms and smaller firms have decided just not to go down that route. And so what they are currently having to do is terminate their relationships with EU clients, because obviously post post-December if there's no deal, and maybe we come back to that, or no other arrangement, I should say, then it would be illegal for them to continue servicing those clients. But I guess the real nub of my answer to your question, James, is that there are still quite a lot of businesses who are hoping for passporting.
Yes.
The things I'm doing at the moment is I'm the vice chair of the policy and regulation chapter of the Khalifa review into fintech in the UK.
Yes.
And we are speaking to swathes of businesses in the fintech ecosystem. And it's quite clear to me that there's a real need there because of things like our need to continue to raise finance, to have investment and capital. Those providers of capital are saying you have to have market access. Those businesses are, in the main, not very clear about exactly what this means for them, or rather the extent to which something's going to save them.
And Rachel, what is the so as if by magic, as you were speaking, Ronald Pereira, who was writing in, commenting on exactly this point, essentially making the argument to you that says, look, there's so many businesses that are established in London for all of the advantages that London has, law, skills, etc., but the inducements are growing to move outside of London. What are the possibilities, or what's the prospect that there is going to be some deal done on passporting? Obviously not by the end of this year, but at some point in the future. And what's the process to ensure that some version of that happens?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that as things stand, by which I mean insofar as we know what's in the current proposed deal, then there really isn't anything substantive for financial services. So just to be clear, there is no passporting right or anything like it in the proposed deal, as far as I am aware. I should also just say that somebody's already mentioned the adequacy, data adequacy point. And of course, in financial services, we have an equivalent regime that's called equivalence. And that basically, if the EU determined the UK to be equivalent in terms of regulation, which self-evidently we are at the moment, then firms could continue to access the EU market. The UK, I think, threw down the gauntlet, as you will know, and unilaterally declared the EU to be equivalent, so EU firms can come here. But that so far hasn't worked. So at the moment, UK firms cannot take advantage of the equivalence regime, which, as I said, would have given passport-like capabilities. So I guess that's important. That might, of course, come alongside a deal. But for me, the real benefit now, and the highest the benefit of a deal can be put on this issue, is that it will keep lines of communication open. So regulatory dialogue, so harmonisation of standards where that is appropriate. So obviously lots of regulation is global these days, and there probably are areas where we want to collaborate and input into global bodies with a bigger group than just the UK. So I think there are positives about the deal that might not be obvious. But what I would say also is, if there's a no deal, that brings other things into question. We start looking more at what we might lose than what we're not gaining. So there are a variety of sort of, for example, memorandum of understanding that are legal in the sense that they're contracts, but they're not legal requirements that they remain in force. So you will be aware that a big issue for European businesses is the extent to which they can outsource back to head office in the UK. Outsourcing is heavily regulated and it's become very political. So it suits the UK to have relaxed rules so that a lot can be outsourced back to the UK. It might suit the EU politically to further restrict that. So I think there are a number of areas which we just haven't really looked at and focused on that are areas of sensitivity if we have no deal.
Okay, that's really interesting, Rachel. I hadn't heard that before. So can you just I'm going to come to Chris in 1 second. So can you just give me an example? What's the kind of thing that you can outsource back to the UK that might be in jeopardy if there's not a deal?
Well, this is a huge issue in relation to discretionary asset management, for example, in the asset management industry, where they might set up a subsidiary in Dublin or Luxembourg, but want to avail themselves of what you might describe as the administration capability, or even in certain cases, the investment management capability that stays in London. So
I see.
It's the so-called brass plate issue. I'm not suggesting that anybody is actually in a brass plate situation, but
No, but I understand that you'd be able to use your London office to do central functions for all of your international business.
and
Okay,
that retain more staff here without having to send them to the appropriate place. Yeah.
wow. Okay, well that's potentially colossal. All right, Rachel, I'm going to come back to you in a moment, if I might. Not least because there are a number of people, as you were speaking, who are writing in there. I suppose some of them are questions and some of them are hopes. So I'm going to ask you to address both of those. But Chris, sorry to do this to you before we even get going. What is data adequacy? What's that about?
So this is about the regulations that govern the transfer of data out with the EU. And you know, a few months ago, I think most of our clients were expecting this situation to be quite straightforward, in that the standard remedy was going to be contractual amendments that would allow data to transfer from the UK, from the EU rather, into the UK. Now there have been European court rulings which have made that rather more complicated recently, and are basically putting the obligation now on the transferor of the information to look at not just the contractual arrangements that are in place for sharing that private data, but also the wider safeguards, considering the need for wider safeguards as to whether if the UK, absent a deal, is not governed to be an adequate environment in which to transfer data to, does that mean that you will all of a sudden find UK companies not being able to source the information from third-party providers, shared service centres, etc., and we will be treated like any other international destination? So got a little bit more complicated recently. Not so much of a problem if you're transferring from the UK into the EU. So those rules are not expected to be affected in the same way. But at the moment, what we're seeing our clients do is they've put the first wave of contractual changes in place to allow that information to be shared, and now just considering how hard will this second test apply in terms of determining the adequacy of the UK as a destination for that data. So I would say, going back to something that Josh led on at the start of the session, that data adequacy designation for the UK, one of the most important things that I think our services clients will be looking for from a Brexit deal.
And Chris, forgive me, not to try and put you in the room, is this data adequacy issue a quid pro quo for some of the others on, that we hear about in terms of state aid or fishing, or is it's just something separate in its own right?
No, this is not really a negotiation. I mean, this is about the rules governing the safeguarding of personal data and the GDPR, which you've heard about previously. So it's about the regulation of the way in which personal data is dealt with. Now, it's not about customers. So if you're dealing direct with a customer, it doesn't impact that relationship. But where you are transferring third-party data, and shared service centres that Rachel talked about are a very good example of that.
Well, can we just start then with Rachel's prepare for the worst setting first, if you like. If there's no deal and there is no agreement on data adequacy, how can companies prepare for that?
Yeah. So Sorry, Rachel, were you about to come in?
No, please, you go.
Yeah, I mean, the advice we're giving all our clients actually is that's got to be the basis you plan on, because at the moment you can't guarantee any other situation. So I talked a moment ago about the contractual changes, which is what most people have been using to deal with the situation thus far. A really important point, though, even before you get that far, is to understand the data flows. I mean, Rachel made a point earlier on about the difference in preparedness across the spectrum of businesses. Very large companies who've got a good resource base have been able to investigate this very thoroughly. Very extensive IT teams to help them mine the data that they're using. But if you're a much smaller business, you might not even have a full inventory of all the different data sources that are being used within your business. So step one actually is to make sure you understand where all that data is coming from, where your IT service providers are based, so that you can actually have the map of what you will need to reconsider.
Right. And Chris, can I ask you something that was slightly more practical transfer questions? What's going to happen on January the 1st about moving people into offices in other parts of Europe. If, let's say, I'd been due a transfer to, I don't know, Frankfurt or Paris before the pandemic struck, I was all ready to go and then been held. What happens at the beginning of January if you're trying to move to another European capital, European operation?
Well, similar sort of advice applies, unfortunately, I guess, James, which is you've got to plan for the assumption that the UK will become a third country status, exactly like anywhere else in the world. So you'll be looking at the real practicalities of whether your passport's got 6 months notice on it yet, and you therefore can travel legally from that point of view. What are the visa arrangements, which will all be bilateral? There's no EU-wide visa program, so there will be bilateral arrangements necessary. So you'll be into the rule book of what governs your transfer to any individual country. And then you've got the sort of nitty-gritty that firms like ours love around, what are the social security rules that are going to apply to you as well in those situations. So there are a raft of complexities which will come into play.
Okay, so Chris, I'm going to just, if I might, Chris and Rachel, I'm going to put a number of questions, actually one to you too, Josh, because there are a load of kind of really practical questions coming in. And the thing that is best about these webinars is seeing how many we can actually get to. One of the questions just come in just on this point is from someone called Andrew Roberts, who says they send staff to a number of European countries to provide QSPM services. Do you know what QSPM services are? I don't know what forgive me, I don't know what they are. But they're QSPM services. Maybe Andrew, you'll just write in, forgive me, I should know my way around this. QSPM services every month for a number of days. And so how will this be impacted from January 2021? I imagine what he's saying is he sends people for a few days, i.e. they're not permanently staffed there.
Yeah. Well, two of the things that I've just mentioned immediately come into play. The mere transfer of people and travel into those locations is going to be more complicated by virtue of those visa and passport rules that I've just described. I don't know the detail of Anthony's business, so I caveat it by saying that. But you will have to think about things like the tax status of those individuals and whether they're creating social security obligations, and in extremis, depending on how long they're there and what type of work they're doing, you've also got to think about the permanent establishment rules as well.
And I would say if there's a deal.
By the way, all has been revealed. Andrew has written in, say it's quantity surveying and project management.
Yes, right.
Yeah, we should have known that. Andrew, thank you very much. Josh, can I put a point to you too, which is a really interesting one? Wayne Andrews, who runs something or works at something called Grace Church Treasury Risk Consultants, asked this point, and you understand why I mentioned where he works. He said, at a time of such unusual uncertainty, why do you think so few importers and exporters focus on managing and hedging their exchange rate risks? So I imagine that's the business that Grace Church Treasury Risk is involved in. But I'm just interested to know, how much is this coming up in your conversation with businesses, worrying about exchange rate volatility?
It's really interesting because I think if you go back a year, actually for a lot of businesses it was one of the top concerns, and there was quite a lot of hedging going on. But you're right. It seems to be a little bit less of a conversation right now. I think that may just be circumstantial. There's so much to deal with at the moment with COVID and Brexit. I think a lot of firms are still hedging, but those currency fluctuations could be very, very dramatic. If we head into no deal, it's not quite clear. I mean, I'd love to get Rachel and Chris's views on this. What's exactly been priced in? And you've got so many different variables at the moment, because of course you've got Brexit, but you've also got the COVID issues that we just discussed. That presumably that makes hedging rather difficult in some ways. So I think it's still there. People are still doing it. But yes, absolutely true that it seems to be less of a debate right now than maybe it was a year ago.
And Josh,
yeah, I think it's another one of those, Josh, where you see different practice across different ends of the spectrum. Larger companies, well resourced, got a good treasury management, can look at that on a very proactive basis. I think Josh used the word bandwidth, and that is the challenge that we see in our middle and smaller tier clients, where you add together COVID, Brexit, and the fact that the economy has got its own challenges at any given point in time anyway. It becomes a real issue for bandwidth for those management teams to think about all those different risks.
I want to come back to one other question that's come up, I know, on a lot of people's minds, particularly young people's minds, which is how much you can transfer your qualifications, what qualifications are going to move, and I don't know, Rachel, whether or not this is an issue in the law. I know it's in many other areas, whether or not the change of terms and whether or not even the skinny deal is a stepping stone to a broader agreement on the transferability of qualifications.
I think Chris probably knows more about this than I do. I think in the legal profession, it's not so much about transfer of qualifications, but there are sort of other consequential issues for the legal profession. For example, whether your advice is privileged is obviously a very key thing,
Yeah.
and that is one of the potential casualties of a no-deal situation. If we're no longer in the EU, it will be difficult for UK lawyers to give advice to EU clients and retain that privilege. I think another body blow occurred this week when certain groups of lawyers, so people who wish to be able to give continuing advice on EU law, which is obviously not necessarily everybody, particularly competition lawyers, have been re-qualifying in another EU jurisdiction. That the most popular, it seems to me, has been Ireland. So a number of law firms have had lawyers requalify there. But last week or the week before, I think the Irish Law Society said that people would not be able to qualify as Irish lawyers or not be able to continue that qualification as Irish lawyers unless they were resident in Ireland.
Wow. Okay.
So the legal profession certainly have some issues around that at the moment. Now, it might be, I think it's still early to tell what people will do about that, and it might be that other jurisdictions don't have that residence requirement. Right. Brussels, for example.
Chris, more broadly, professional qualifications, have you got a sense of, the reason I ask this question is that I think a few months ago when we were talking on one of these CBI calls, one of the arguments made in favour of getting even a skinny deal was that even if qualifications weren't, the issue wasn't resolved, it would be a stepping stone to resolving them in the future. I didn't know whether or not you've got a sense of the direction of travel on that.
Yeah, so this, I mean, this varies very much from sector to sector. I mean, Rachel's talked about the legal profession. Obviously, you know, we, as a firm of accountants, we focused a lot on auditing, for example, and the ability to actually deliver those services is you know, significantly impacted. You know, we've had to change some of the arrangements we've got with our Irish firm, and most of the larger businesses in this field are members at the very least of international networks, or they've got correspondent arrangements, and that will be important because the actual delivery of the professional advice in the way that Rachel described will be challenged. There is, again, no EU-wide recognition, and I don't think Josh may know different, but I don't think there's an expectation that that would be dealt with as part of a deal. I think that would be much more down to the individual regulators agreeing the arrangements that will apply. The ability of the individual to go and practice and work for a firm, of course, is not necessarily influenced in the same way. That's an overseas posting, but the delivery of the professional advice at the end of it by that firm, I think, becomes more difficult.
Yeah, absolutely right. I think it's a classic example of why a deal matters so much, because if you know the recognition, and it's worth checking with regulators in country to see where the conversations about recognition are, because they vary in each individual country. And some, the regulator has actually decided to recognise. In others, that decision has not yet been taken. But for most, the intention is to try and build consistency. If you end up with a deal, you can sort of see that for individual regulators, the optimism, the confidence is there, the relationship is going to remain intact. That helps to smooth that transition. If you end up with no deal, it's much, much more uncertain. So it's just one amongst many reasons why, even if there's not that much on services within a deal, it still is of material importance to the way that 2021 looks.
Josh, there are a couple of really quite sort of in the weeds technical questions, but the more we've done these webinars, the more I thought actually these ones might be the killer questions. So will you allow me just to get into a couple of them? Rachel, this is one for you, and you can hear my nervousness as I raise it. The Lugano Convention. It sounds like a Robert Ludlum novel, but what is it, and why is it that people are now increasingly worried about UK's inability to access the Lugano Convention?
Yeah, I wish it was a Robert Ludlum novel. we'd be better off. And I go back to my point that you don't know how much you value something till you miss it. So the Lugano Convention, and indeed an associated piece of legislation, which I think is called the Recast Brussels Regulation. So those two things together govern relations with the EU and with other EFTA countries. So it's not just one thing. But what those two things do together is basically create a really efficient and robust system. First of all, for recognising and supporting jurisdiction clauses in the contract. So, so which jurisdiction will have authority to hear a dispute. So it's partly about supporting that, but it's perhaps even more importantly is the recognition or the enforcement of judgments. So if you go to a UK court because they have a good reputation, you trust them, and you get your judgment, and that needs to be enforced against parties in 3 different EU member states. At the moment, there's just a seamless way of doing that. I think the UK government wanted to accede to Lugano and indeed possibly Brussels. But as things stand, both the EU and I think it's Denmark have not given consent. And the way those things work, it requires consent of all parties before you can accede. So as a minimum, even if they consent now, then you have to wait 3 months before the point of the last consent received. So there will already inevitably be a gap. As I say, even if we can do that. But I think basically this is about really a cost issue and a process issue. And if we don't ultimately accede to these things, you will have to look at the domestic law in each jurisdiction that you might want to either hear a court case in or have a judgment enforced in. So it really goes back to this point about just efficient models. But I think the message is that people should have a look at their jurisdiction clauses and just model through what disputes might arise and with whom, and what that might mean for whether you actually want to make changes there.
Right. Rachel, thank you. Chris, can I just come back to you for just one final thought? I'm really struck by Rachel's opening observation that the answer to the financial services question is quite easy. It divides big and small. And I'm just wondering, when you're looking at KPMG's clients, what you're hearing in terms of preparedness in the context of COVID, whether you're seeing a similar division across professional services too.
Yeah, I think it's a very fair observation, James, that's the case. I mean, I think that's a function of a couple of things. The larger firms are better resourced, as I've said a couple of times. It's easier for them to refocus resource to face into a challenge like this, but they also tend to be the ones that have got developed international networks. And so the solution to lots of these problems is to use in-country delivery. And so if you're part of an international network, you've got correspondent arrangement in each of the key European jurisdictions, it's obviously less of a challenge. Now, if you are a mid to small size firm that's maybe done the odd piece of cross-border work, or as we heard from Andrew earlier on, is sending teams over to individual European countries point by point, it's a lot more difficult. You probably haven't got the requirement or the need to establish subsidiaries or correspondent arrangements. So that is a challenge to begin with. But I think the second reason why it's harder for the smaller businesses in terms of dealing with the flexibility is it's sourcing the resource on day one to deal with the problem. You haven't got the kind of bandwidth in businesses like that to suddenly say, well, first week in January, everyone is focused on solving our Brexit issues. You probably arrange your own travel. You probably fill in your own tax returns. You haven't got big back office teams to help with it. So it's a fair observation. I think we've seen it not just in services, actually right across the whole Brexit discussion in manufacturing, in distribution. Basically, the larger the company, the better able they are to address these challenges.
Well, which is ironic, not least because the same you hear in COVID preparedness too. Sorry, Rachel, you want to come back in?
I was just going to say, I completely agree, but I think it's not just resource. I mean, in the first instance, the first issue that affects people is the resource of being able to work out what the problem is and how best to solve it. right at the outset, we saw the larger companies do comprehensive international surveys of which regulatory regime was the most beneficial to them. There were even discussions about having changes to rules and regulations made by individual regulators who are kind of fighting for their business. But it was a big thing for those organisations. So I do certainly agree about the resource issue. But as I said earlier, even if you could get over that, the cost of the magic bullet, so to a subsidiarising and getting your subsidiary regulated is a magic bullet. But the cost of getting to that point is enormous. Applications for authorisation, slightly dependent on what your business is, but that's a big deal. Once you are authorised, you've got a duplicating structure. So you've got 2 boards of directors, you've got 2 risk committees, or whatever it might be. You've got 2 lots of capital. That's so inefficient. You've got the stress, if you like, over this outsourcing arrangement I mentioned earlier. Is that going to last or not last? So I think that's why I said in my opening remarks, I think there are a lot of people for whom that just doesn't make sense.
Yes, yeah. I see that, Rich. Just one thing before I throw back to Josh. You may have the answer to this, Josh, but I imagine it may be more for you, Chris, which is just your point about people travelling to European businesses or European offices, which is, do you know where there is guidance for businesses on business visas for the delivery of their services? Where do you go to find out what you're supposed to do?
Yeah, well, Josh, I'll stand to be corrected by you, but my understanding on this is a country by country arrangement. There isn't a one-stop shop for the whole of the EU that allows you that flexibility. So it is literally a case of working out which is the country I'm going to. I mean, many companies I know use third-party providers to help them with their travel, and they, I would expect, in most cases, certainly the case within KPMG, providing us with lots of useful guidance around this. But I think, unless you know different, Josh, this is a point-to-point solution.
That's absolutely right. Unless, if there is a deal, there is an opportunity for a fly-in, fly-out agreement similar to what we've got with Canada and Japan. But in the absence of a deal, it's country by country.
Rachel, Chris, thank you so much. It's quite a way to start the week, I have to say, listening to this. When you get, I think it was Sam Goldwyn who said about Hollywood, that when you get beyond the tinsel of Hollywood, you get to the real tinsel. It feels like when you get beyond the detail of Brexit, you get to the real detail, and it feels like we've got some of that this morning. So thank you. But Josh, before we finish up, can I just ask you about the priorities for the CBI this week? Because I appreciate the Brexit points we're in the weeds of here, but presumably you've got a to-do list which is focused on a fair few other things. So will you just sort of frame it for us?
Yes, in a sense, it's back to where we started. Obviously, a real priority is around those COVID announcements. Do they give businesses the ability to plan, ability to build in resilience? Is there enough clarity there? Are there any gaps? So a big stream of work on that. On the spending review, it's more about assessing it. It's vitally important, but it's not quite as day-to-day urgent in the same way. So let's see what comes through. But of course, we'll then be following up with members to give guidance. But so much is about Brexit. It's about, the meeting I mentioned with Michael Gove, absolutely making sure that the guidance they are giving, and this is one of the big conversations that we've had, is specific. It's not that advice to businesses should not be political. It should not pretend that everything's going to be all right. It needs to be detailed, it needs to be specific, and it needs to be honest. And that point's been taken on board. So helping to adapt that. Desperately hoping for positive news, which we will welcome, but then really thinking whether it's a deal or no deal, what actually needs to be done for January. All of the side deals that we've spoken about, all of those easements, all of those facilitations, will have a very short window to get those done. Working here, but also with Business Europe and across Europe to try and get as much agreement on those as possible.
Yeah, and I'm well aware, and I'm sure people on the call are aware too, that it does matter where in the UK you are. The questions around in Northern Ireland in particular, we've not got to this morning, but I know we will do in the light of the deal if and when it comes. But for this morning, a big thank you to Rachel Kent from Hogan Lovells. Very good to have you with us too, Chris Harold from KPMG, and as ever, Josh Hardy, Deputy Director General of CBI. Very nice to see you. Have a very good day and a very good week, everyone. See you back, CBI at 10 on Wednesday. Thanks so much.
Bye.